to find your common ancestors, Part 3. In Part 1, we looked at various ways you can do clusters with your DNA matches. We picked one particular cluster we wanted to study in more detail. This was because of a DNA match that I have that I'm calling Joe Smith, which is not his real name, that I've been very interested in determining how he and I match and figuring out the common ancestor. In Part 2, we investigated my family a bit more, looking at my ancestors that lived in the same part of Ireland where Joe's family lived, to see if we could find clues to this connection. We looked at the segment matches in DNA Painter that came from the cluster we had run in Part 1, and we also used Genetic Affairs Auto Kinship to see the relationship between Joe and some of the close matches that he had in the cluster. Now in Part 3, we're going to build out a tree for Joe's family and see if we can find the most recent common ancestor between Joe and me, or if, the very least, if we can come up with a hypothesis for what the connection is. So Joe's tree, he has a small tree on Ancestry. I've hidden all the surnames and replaced those on his paternal line with Smith, since that's what I'm calling his paternal side of his family. We know the father, grandfather, and great-grandfather's forenames, and so that's going to be helpful in looking up records. And we also know that his father was born in County Limerick, which will be also very helpful for our investigation. Many records were lost in Ireland in the 1922 fire at the Public Records Office in Four Courts, Dublin. Actually, many records still survive, and a lot more than some people realize. But what was lost was the early census, also the Church of Ireland parish records. The Church of Ireland was the official church of the country, and it served as the civil parish lines as well. So all of the civil records from those parishes would have been lost in the fire. All of the Catholic parish records were kept at the Catholic Church themselves, so none of them would have been in the Public Record Office. The 1901 and 1911 census were also not in the Public Records Office at the time of the fire, which was very fortunate for our use. So you can find the 1901 and 1911 census free online at the National Archives of Ireland. You can find civil records in Ireland beginning in 1864, and these are free online at civilrecordsirishgenealogy.ie. The births continue from 1864 until 1920, and then after that date, they're not available for privacy reasons. The marriages go to 1945, again after the date, not available for privacy reasons, and deaths are there until 1970. Many of the Catholic baptismal records and marriage records are found at the National Library of Ireland. They don't have an index for them there, but there are indices for them at Find My Path, Roots Ireland, Ancestry, and Family Search. Using the index makes it very useful because you can get the exact date, so that then when you look at the National Library records, you know exactly where to start in terms of what page to be on, as opposed to doing a fingertip search through the whole year. Another source is the Griffiths Valuation. It's free online at askaboutireland.ie. It's also at Find My Past. It lists the tenant, the area of the land, the tax paid on the land and the house, and it serves as a census substitute Griffith's valuations were taken starting in the south of Ireland and moving to the north from 1847 to 1864. And pretty much every male that was renting a house or a place to live or renting land would show up in the Griffiths valuation. The Ordnance Survey maps also available for the areas that go along with the Griffiths valuation. So next we're going to build out a tree for Joe. So Joe's father was born in 1930. That's too late to find information in the civil birth records. They go up to 1920 for privacy reasons. But we know where his father was born, so we can use the birth location to then look for his grandfather Michael's 1911 census records. So here's a page of the 1911 census showing grandfather Michael's family. I've replaced their surnames with Smith. We have Michael and his wife Mary and 2 children. Daughter Mary doesn't have an age listed, which typically means that she's less than a year old. But having the actual approximate ages of the people in the family, we can now look for civil birth information for them. Also on the National Archives site, you can look at the actual census records that the head of the family filled in. And so here we have the one that Michael Smith filled in. We have the birth approximate ages, just like before. It also says that they were all born in County Limerick, which is very useful information for looking up civil records. It says that the parents have been married for 7 years. So now we can have information to be able to look for the marriage between Michael and Mary. It also tells us that they've had 5 children, but only 2 are alive. And so it would be the 2 that are listed here on the census. But that means that there are 3 other children in that time period from when they married that we could potentially find civil death records for. So if we look at the Irish birth record, here's the birth record for one of Michael and Mary's children. It has the birth date, 8th February 1908. It has the residence where the parents lived, Darmstown, the name of the child and the sex of the child. It also gives the mother's maiden name, which is the first place we found that, so that would be very helpful in now looking for the wedding between Michael and Mary, now that we have her maiden name. It lists the father's occupation. He's a laborer. So if we follow the records, we could look up Michael's marriage record now, because we have his wife's maiden name. And it would give the information of his father's name, but we already know his father's name. So rather than looking up that record, we'll skip to the next one and go look for the marriage record for Patrick, great-grandfather Patrick. So here's his marriage record. It also gives us a lot of information. It says that they were married on the 1st of March, 1870. It gives his wife's maiden name, Joanna O'Brien. So now we have found that Patrick Smith, great-grandfather to Joe that we're researching, that Joe's great-grandmother was Joanna O'Brien. It gives the ages of the bride and groom. It's likely that what looks like to me like 15 is probably supposed to be 18. It would be very unusual for a 15-year-old girl to be marrying in this time period. It's the first marriage for both Patrick and Joanna. Patrick is a laborer. They both live in Martinstown. And it also gives information about the fathers of both the groom and the bride. We can see that Patrick's father's name is Michael, and he's deceased. And Joanna O'Brien's father is alive, and he's Michael O'Brien. And both of the fathers are laborers. So now we can add another name to Joe's tree. We know that his great-grandmother was Joanna O'Brien. And O'Brien is the connection that I was looking for, basically, because my Joanna O'Brien lived in County Limerick in about the same area as Joe Smith's family. And so my thought had been that the connection could be on that side. So this could explain the connection that my second cousin Trish and I have to Joe's paternal line. Looking at that marriage record again, we see that they were married at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Balgadon. Now that's the same Catholic church where Bridget Fenton, my great-grandmother, was baptized. And her mother is the Joanna O'Brien that's my second great-grandmother. Usually a bride would be married in her home church, so it seems likely that this Joanna O'Brien grew up in that parish. And if that's the case, we should be able to find her baptismal record there. So I searched for Joanna's baptismal record. Assuming that it said she was 18 years old, I put in 1852 as the potential year, with a plus-minus 5 years on it. We know her father's first name is Michael. And only one comes up. And this Joanna was baptized in 1850. And looking at the record, we see that her mother is Kate Coffey. Now, if you remember from part 2, when I was looking at the fan club for my Bridget, who was baptized at the Balgadon Catholic Church in 1853, and one of her godparents was Joanna Coffey, and Coffey, that surname jumped out at me because I have a couple of DNA matches who have a Coffey in their tree, and the person lived in this part of Limerick. So then I went searching for others in the Balgadon Catholic Church that had that surname, and I found that a Catherine Coffey had married Michael Bryan in 1847. When I searched for their children, I found they had 8 children baptized there, but without having a clear reason, I didn't want to go down 8 rabbit holes trying to chase down the family. And so I left it hanging at that part. And now we know the reason. It's the same Catherine Coffey and Michael Bryan, who we now find out are Joe's second great-grandparents. So we can add them to Joe's tree. So the Joanna O'Brien, who married Patrick Smith, Joe's great-grandfather, is a daughter of Michael O'Brien and Catherine Coffey that we had seen earlier. Can we go back any further? Well, Griffith's valuation was in 1852 in this part of Limerick, and Joanna O'Brien here was baptized in 1850. So we should be able to find her father Michael in Griffith's valuation. And there he is. He has a house and a garden at location 8A in this town parish. So here's the map, and I've circled the area that should be where Michael O'Brien and Catherine Coffey and their family lived. But now we're stuck. We've taken the baptismal records back as far as they are at this parish. We've got Griffith's valuation, and we can't go back any further. We've run out of records. And this is a problem that happens quite often when you start going back in records in Ireland. It just depends on the individual area and the Catholic Church in that area as to how far the records will take you back. But it's enough for me to come up with a hypothesis. So my hypothesis is that Joe's second great-grandfather, Michael O'Brien, and my second grandmother, Joanna O'Brien, were siblings. That would mean that Joe and I are fourth cousins. And my reasoning behind all of this, my Joanna O'Brien baptized her daughter, Bridget Fenton, at the Balgadon Catholic Church Parish in September of 1853. Joe's Michael O'Brien married at that same parish in 1847. Michael's daughter, Joanna, was baptized there in 1850, and she married Patrick Smith there in 1870, and Patrick Smith is Joe's great-grandfather, based on tracing back Irish records that are readily available online to find the birth dates, the marriage dates, the marriage record, find the maiden names of the people involved. And so this would make my second cousin Trish and me fourth cousins to Joe. So going back to the segment data in DNA Painter that I got from the cluster auto painter that I did in part 2 using the MyHeritage cluster that we had looked at in part 1, I can now take these segments on chromosome 7 and chromosome 8, where Trish and I triangulate with several people in the Smith family, Joe, Sarah, and Sue on chromosome 7, and Sue, Sarah, and Sue's son Frank on chromosome 8. And now I can say, instead of saying those are Smith segments, I can say they're O'Brien segments and come up with the hypothesis to my family. So, in summary, in part 1, we looked at various auto clusters. We took one from MyHeritage that had this DNA match that I called Joe Smith, that I was very interested in learning how we were connected, and we looked at that one in more detail. In part 2, we looked at my family and looked back at the records that already were available and what I could find online to indicate where in Limerick my family was from. We then found the segments on the various chromosomes from the cluster with Joe Smith's family, and we found segments where Joe and other family members triangulated with Trish and me. We looked at the auto kinship from Genetic Affairs in part 2 to look for possible family connections with Joe and others on the cluster. And then in part 3, we built out a more detailed paternal tree for Joe using available Irish records, the 1911, 1901 census, civil birth and marriage records, and then baptismal records from the Catholic parish at Balgadon, to be able to come up with a hypothesis for how Joe's paternal Smith line connects to my cousin Trish and me. Any questions? You can contact me at patriciacolemangenealogy.com. You can also find me on Facebook as a moderator for DNA Painter user group and the moderator for the Genetic Affairs user group.